Have you ever sat quietly and wondered when everything started to change between you and your children? When your voice started to carry less weight? When your help started being expected instead of appreciated? When your love, once a warm offering, became something taken for granted? It often happens so gradually that you barely notice at first. One day, you're dropping everything to help them, watching the grandkids, offering money when things get tight, listening for hours without interrupting, and it all feels like love. It feels right, but over time, something shifts. The thank yous become fewer. The visits become one-sided, and slowly, without meaning to, you find yourself giving more than you have, just to hold on to something that used to be freely shared. There's a certain silence that comes with this kind of realization. Not an angry silence, not even a sad one, just a quiet ache. The kind that settles into your bones when you begin to wonder if your kindness has turned into a currency, one they spend without ever refilling the jar. Maybe you've felt it too. I once knew a woman named Grace. She was the kind of mother everyone admired, warm, giving, always ready with a pot of tea and an open heart. When her daughter Emily divorced and moved back home with 2 children, Grace welcomed them with open arms. She cooked, cleaned, played with the kids, even dipped into her modest savings to help Emily get back on her feet. At first, there was so much gratitude, hugs, smiles. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Mom." But then, slowly, things began to change. Emily started coming home late from work without calling. The children would get dropped off with barely a word. Grace found herself doing everything: homework, baths, lunches, while Emily scrolled on her phone or slipped away for just an hour. That hour would become 2, then 3, then the whole evening. Grace didn't complain. Not at first. She believed it was her job to be there, that this was just a hard season. But one night, after putting the kids to bed and cleaning up the mess alone again, she sat in her chair and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in years: resentment. It was a quiet, painful thing. Not because she didn't love her family, she did, but because she realized she was disappearing inside her own kindness. That's the first sign when your love starts to cost you parts of yourself, when kindness becomes obligation, when giving begins to feel like erasing. And still, it can be hard to name it, especially when it comes from those closest to you. We tell ourselves, it's just a phase. They don't mean to. I should be more patient. But kindness, real kindness, should never feel like swallowing your needs day after day. There's a second sign that often follows close behind. When your no becomes negotiable, or even ignored. Jack, a retired firefighter, loved his 3 grandchildren more than anything. Every weekend, his daughter would drop them off for what started as a visit, but quickly turned into an expectation. He adored the kids, but he also had a few medical issues, and was beginning to feel the strain. One day, after a particularly rough night of back pain, he told his daughter he couldn't take the kids that weekend. She laughed. "Oh, come on, Dad. You'll be fine once they're there." He repeated it. "I mean it, sweetheart. I need to rest this weekend." Her smile faded. She got cold. "I just don't know what I'd do if I didn't have your help," she said. But fine. That fine lingered like smoke after a fire. And even though he had spoken his truth, Jack spent the whole weekend feeling guilty, like he'd let her down. That's the quiet trap so many fall into, where setting a boundary feels like betrayal. When love has been measured by how much you give up, it becomes easy to forget that saying no isn't selfish, it's sacred. But what happens when your boundaries are not just ignored, but questioned or even punished with silence? Sometimes, the third sign is even more subtle. When your presence is only welcomed when you're doing something for them. Think about the last time your phone rang. Was it because they wanted to hear how you were doing, or because they needed something? Did they call just to say, "I miss you," or to ask for a ride, a loan, a favor? It's a painful thing to admit, but there's a difference between being loved and being useful. And after a certain age, especially after 60, many people find that usefulness becomes the glue holding their relationships together, until one day, they wonder, if I stopped giving, would they still come around? I once met a woman named Hannah at a community center. She had a bright laugh and kind eyes, and she used to host Sunday dinners for her whole family: roast chicken, fresh bread. Pion. Her kids would show up hungry, leave full, and always thank her as they left. But over the years, the thanks grew thinner. The requests got heavier. Her son started asking for money to cover his rent. Her daughter wanted her to babysit twice a week. When Hannah said she wanted to cut back on the dinners, they stopped calling for a while. "I just wanted to rest," she said softly. "I wanted them to come for me, not for the meal." That longing, to be seen not as a convenience, but as a person, it's deep and it's valid. You are more than what you give. You always have been. And when you start to feel like the giving is the only reason you're welcome, that's not love. That's not family. That's a transaction. What makes all of this so complex is that it's rarely cruel on purpose. Most of the time, the people taking your kindness for granted don't even realize they're doing it. They've just grown used to it, used to you, used to the way you always say yes, always step in, always smooth things over. But just because they're used to it doesn't mean it's right. And just because you've always done it doesn't mean you have to keep doing it. Sometimes, the most generous thing you can do for yourself and for them is to stop. Sometimes, the most generous thing you can do for yourself and for them is to stop. Not stop loving, not stop caring, but stop the quiet unraveling of your own needs. Stop the story that says your worth is measured by how much you bend, how much you give, how much you go unnoticed. Because the truth is, something deeper lies beneath these patterns, not just in them, but in us too. Many of us were raised in a time when being kind meant being quiet, when making peace meant keeping silent, when putting family first meant putting yourself last. It was noble, it was selfless, and for a while, it worked, until it didn't. Somewhere along the line, being needed began to replace being valued, and in doing so, many carried a hidden weight, the belief that to be loved, you had to be indispensable. Take Margaret, for example. She was a soft-spoken woman who had been a caretaker all her life, first to her younger siblings, then to her husband, and later to her 2 sons. She never asked for anything, not even a birthday gift, not even help around the house. And when her husband passed, her sons leaned on her even more. One day, her youngest, Ryan, showed up with laundry, hungry kids, and a chaotic schedule. He didn't ask if she had plans. He just assumed she'd watch them. She did. And the next time, and the time after that, until one morning, she looked in the mirror and saw a tired face staring back. A face that hadn't been invited to lunch in months. A face that hadn't heard, "How are you, Mom?" in longer than she could remember. That's when it hit her. She had trained everyone around her to believe she didn't have needs. And now, they treated her like she didn't. This is the quiet erosion that happens when we confuse being helpful with being invisible. When our yes becomes so automatic that no one ever thinks to ask if we're okay. It's not always about the big moments. Sometimes, it's the small, constant ones that wear you down. The unreturned calls, the assumptions, the last-minute requests. The way your feelings get brushed aside with a, "You're strong, you'll be fine." But even strength has limits. And strength doesn't mean silence. Frank, a widower in his late 60s, used to avoid conflict at all costs. His oldest daughter, Chloe, had a temper, and he didn't want to upset her. So, even when she spoke to him harshly or dismissed his opinions, he let it slide. He told himself, "She's busy, she doesn't mean it." But deep down, every time he bit his tongue, he felt a small sting, not from her words, but from his own silence. Avoiding conflict became a way of surviving, but it wasn't living. One day, after an argument about how he handled a minor issue with his grandson, Chloe raised her voice, called him old-fashioned, and stormed out. For the first time, Frank didn't chase after her. He didn't apologize. He sat with the discomfort, the sadness, and the clarity. He realized he had spent years walking on eggshells in his own relationship with his daughter, not because she demanded it, but because he was afraid that if he pushed back, he'd lose her. But love that punishes you for honesty isn't love, it's control. It takes time to see it, and even more time to accept it. But the heart knows. When it's tired of being twisted into shapes it doesn't belong in. At some point, there comes a quiet rebellion, a sacred one. It doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it's a whisper, not today. Sometimes it's a pause before you answer the phone. Sometimes it's deciding not to explain yourself when you say no, and that's where the healing begins. Helen, at 72, started setting small boundaries, not grand declarations, just small, clear lines. She stopped answering calls after 9 p.m. She no longer lent money without discussion. When asked to babysit, she gave her availability, and if it didn't work, she simply said so. At first, her children were surprised. One even accused her of changing, and she had changed into someone who respected herself as much as she loved others. And slowly, they changed too. They began to ask instead of assume, to check in before dropping by, to say thank you without being reminded. It wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. Because here's what people don't often tell you. When you begin to honor yourself, you teach others how to honor you too. Not through force, not through guilt, but through presence, through calm, unwavering truth. You don't need to fight to be seen. You just need to stop dimming your light to make others comfortable. Respect doesn't come from sacrificing yourself at every turn. It comes from standing quietly in your truth, even if your voice shakes a little the first time you speak it. It comes from trusting that your needs matter not more than anyone else's, but not less, either. And perhaps the most powerful shift is this: when you stop trying to earn love through service and start embracing love through presence. You are not just a parent or a grandparent or a helper. You are a whole person. You have dreams, limits, joys, and grief. You have the right to rest, to be cared for, to be asked how you're doing, and to answer honestly. So if you've ever felt that ache, that whisper that something isn't sitting right anymore, listen to it. It's not weakness, it's wisdom. The kind of wisdom that comes not from age alone, but from finally hearing your own voice again, soft, steady, and true. And when you begin to live from that place, something beautiful begins to shift. And when you begin to live from that place, something beautiful begins to shift. It's not always loud. It doesn't come with trumpets or applause, but it's real, and you'll feel it first in the smallest of moments. Like when you say no without flinching, or when you sit at your kitchen table with your tea, watching the light change across the wall, and you don't feel rushed. You don't feel guilty. You just feel like yourself. That's how healing begins, quietly, from the inside out. Emily, the same daughter who once treated her mother Grace more like a nanny than a parent, began to notice something had changed. Grace didn't stop loving her. She didn't storm out or make ultimatums, but she stopped saying yes to everything. When Emily asked her to watch the kids all weekend on short notice, Grace smiled and said, "I love them, sweetheart. But I have plans. Maybe next time." Emily was stunned. Not angry, just surprised. It was the first time her mother had gently refused. And something shifted. She started calling more, not just to ask for things, but to talk. She started asking how Grace was doing. She started remembering her mother, not just as grandma or helper or reliable, but as Grace, a woman with her own time, her own feelings, her own life. That's the quiet power of self-respect. It doesn't demand change from others, but it invites it. You begin to carry yourself differently, and the people around you, they sense it. They might resist at first. Some will test your boundaries. Some may even pull away. That's okay, because the people who truly love you will learn to meet you where you stand, not where you bend. Ethan, a retired teacher, spent most of his 70s feeling invisible to his adult sons. They rarely visited unless they needed something, a signature, a check, help moving furniture. He gave and gave, thinking it was the only way to stay close. But one day, he simply stopped. He still loved them, still answered when they called. But he stopped offering before they asked, stopped overextending, stopped rushing in to rescue problems they could solve on their own. At first, there was distance. They didn't know what to do with this new version of their father, the one who didn't always say yes. But slowly, they came back. This time, not just to lean on him, but to be with him. They started bringing their kids around, just to visit. They asked for his advice, not just his money. They listened, because when Ethan stopped proving his worth, He made space for it to be seen. That's the lesson so many of us learn late in life. When you stop chasing respect, you start embodying it, and people respond, not because you taught them a lesson, but because you reminded them of your presence. Think of it like the sun. The sun doesn't ask for attention. It doesn't follow anyone. It just rises, steadily, every morning. And because of that, the world turns to meet it. That's what happens when you stand in your light. You stop needing to explain yourself. You stop trying to please everyone. You begin to understand that you matter not for what you do, but for who you are. And slowly, the anxiety that once clung to every interaction, will they still love me if I say no, starts to fall away. In its place grows something steadier. Not pride, not defiance, but peace. Margaret, who had once buried her needs beneath a lifetime of selflessness, began volunteering twice a week at a local shelter. It wasn't for praise. It wasn't to feel needed. It was just for her. She said it was the first time in decades she remembered what her own voice sounded like when no one else was asking anything from it. And her sons, they didn't vanish. They adjusted. And eventually, they admired her more. Not because she was finally doing something for herself, but because they realized how much she had always given and how little they'd truly seen her. That's the beauty of transformation in later life. It's not about reinventing yourself. It's about returning to the parts of you that got left behind in all the giving. It's remembering that your joy matters, that your time is precious, that your peace is worth protecting. And the miracle is, when you begin to live from that place, from calm, steady dignity, the people around you take notice. Not always right away, but they feel it. They feel the difference between a person who gives out of fear and one who gives from fullness. One gives because they're afraid of losing love. The other gives because they already hold love inside. And that's what I want for you. Not to be harder, not to be colder, but to be whole. To live your days not as someone everyone depends on, but as someone who chooses, freely and fully, how to love and how to be loved in return. You don't need to be loud to be heard. You only need to stand firmly in your light. Because the truth is, your worth was never measured by how much you could do for others. Your worth is who you are when you stop shrinking. When you stop apologizing for needing rest. When you stop explaining your no. When you choose your own joy, even if no one claps for it. And if that makes someone uncomfortable, let it. Because the right people, the ones who truly love you, will meet you there. They'll see your light, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. And in that light, the relationships that are meant to grow will. And in that light, the relationships that are meant to grow will. I want to thank you, truly, for spending this time with me, for staying through these quiet reflections, for opening your heart, even if it ached, for letting the truth settle gently inside, even if it stirred something tender. Because I know this isn't always easy to hear. It's one thing to recognize these signs that your kindness is being taken for granted, that your presence is being used instead of cherished. But it's another thing entirely to begin living differently, to unlearn decades of habits that told you to keep giving no matter how empty you felt inside. That takes courage, a quiet, steady kind of courage, the kind that doesn't look like shouting or slamming doors, but looks like softly saying, I matter. 2. Looks like choosing to rest without guilt. Like deciding you don't need to prove your worth anymore because it's already yours. And if you're still here, still listening, then maybe part of you already knew, maybe you felt it for a long time, that something inside you was asking for more. More peace, more respect, more space to simply be. So let me ask you something now gently. Honestly, has your relationship with your adult children changed over time? Have you ever felt unseen or quietly used? What helped you cope? What helped you grow through it? If you feel safe, I would be honored to hear your story in the comments. Not for attention, not for advice, but for connection, because your story, your voice matters more than you know. And if something in this message made you feel seen, if a sentence wrapped itself around a part of you that's been waiting to be named, I'd love for us to stay connected. This space we've shared today, it doesn't have to end here. Click subscribe if you'd like to walk this road with me a little longer. Not just for videos, but for moments like this. Moments of quiet strength, of soft truth, of remembering that it's never too late to live a life that feels like your own. And if you know someone, a sister, a friend, a neighbor who might need these words too, I hope you'll share this with them, because sometimes the most powerful gift we can give each other is not advice, but acknowledgement. A simple, "I see you, I've been there too, and you're not alone." That's what I hope you carry with you as we part for now. You are not alone. There are others walking this same gentle path away from guilt, toward dignity, away from being used, toward being seen. So take your time, breathe. Let your boundaries be soft, but strong. Let your kindness remain, but let it have roots, not just wings, and never forget. You deserve a life where you're not just needed, but valued, where your no is honored, your silence is respected, and your joy is allowed to take up space. You've spent so much of your life giving. Now, it's your time to receive, to be held, to be heard, to be whole. I'm so glad you're here. Until next time, take care of your heart and keep standing gently in your light.